Consider supporting this podcast on Patreon. On this episode of the What is Asia podcast, I interview one of my former professors, Bryna Goodman, a scholar of Chinese history at the University of Oregon, to talk about her book, which was a finalist for the Oregon Book Award, The Suicide of Miss Xi, Democracy and Disenchantment in the Chinese Republic. Dr. Goodman, thanks for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
So your book, I have it here. It's The Suicide of Miss Xi, Democracy and Disenchantment in the Chinese Republic. So when I first got this book and I saw the title, I was so struck by just how provocative it was. We have suicide, democracy, disenchantment. So parsing that apart, just thinking about the first part of that title, who is Miss Xi? What is her story? And why did she take her own life? And then if you can connect that to the cursory overview of how her death is relevant to the larger story of the Republic of China.
Sure. First question's easier than the second one. Miss Xi, the full name was Xi Shangzhen. She was a young woman who was a clerk in a Shanghai newspaper office, a Chinese newspaper that was called the Journal of Commerce, in September of 1922. At work, she closed the office door and hung herself in the office that she shared with her employer. What intrigued me about this suicide, so I'll explain a little bit about how I came upon this topic, because it is a bit odd. I can see why you might wonder about it. I first ran across mention of this suicide when I was working on another book entirely, a book about native place associations in Shanghai, associations of people who came from different areas of China and were living in Shanghai. And her employer was a member of the powerful Cantonese Guangzhou community in Shanghai. She was in the Suzhou Dongting Dongshan community. And I was working on these native place groups, and I came upon the case mentioned in each, in the records of each community. It intrigued me for a while, but it was a complicated case. These communities often dealt with disputes among their members, legal cases, other issues in the city. I couldn't quite figure out the case at that time. It was mysterious, it intrigued me, but it was puzzling. And I put it aside, it didn't fit in that book. Then years later, I ran across mention of this case in some writing by one of the first organizers, first founding members of the Chinese Communist Party, Chen Wangdao. And I thought to myself, why was he writing about this case? Because as far as I knew at that point, it was a puzzling case, but he didn't belong to either community. And then trying to figure out that question, I began to look in Chinese newspapers, and I saw the case was all over the newspapers. It was a huge scandal. After she committed suicide, every newspaper in Shanghai began to write about this case. And then a series of interesting events took place. So it wasn't just the event of her suicide, but her suicide then brought her family to raise some accusations against her employer. Her employer was a very interesting man. He was a social activist, a nationalist activist, who had organized a tax strike against Shanghai being a semi-colonial city. He had organized a tax strike against the Anglo-American authorities of the International Settlement of Shanghai. And he was an activist in Shanghai's nationalist May 4th movement, a protest against the Treaty of Versailles, which gave German interests in Shandong province over to Japan against Chinese national interests and expectations. So he was a well-known figure, a kind of celebrity reformer activist figure, also head of this rather interesting newspaper. And so her suicide raised questions about his behavior as well. And her family lodged these two accusations. One, that he had pressured her to be his concubine, and so aggrieved her that she committed suicide. And two, that he had defrauded her of money on the Chinese stock exchange. The first accusation was thrown out. The second accusation was taken up by the Chinese court. That actually was rather complicated because of Shanghai's divided jurisdictions, and the suit was tried in Chinese court after he was kidnapped in the dead of night on the border between the area of Chinese jurisdiction and an area of foreign jurisdiction in the city. So all kinds of things were going on in this case that intrigued me. And the discussion of the case had very much to do with, on the one hand, the question of a woman who had the features of a modern working woman. In that sense, she was identified in much of the discussion as a modern woman, a new woman. And this self-styled new man, public activist, celebrity, kind of celebrity figure, and his newspaper. So all of that was, in a sense, in play. As I began to try to figure out the case, it had many puzzles in it for me. And one of the puzzles was why it was so featured in public discussion. As one commentator said, many people kill themselves, many people die, but when this one woman committed suicide, it so shook public opinion that not a pen remained dry. So I was trying to figure out why that was. And as I worked on the case, it seemed to me that it brought together in interesting ways issues of the transformation of gender roles, public access to the market and the transformation of the market, the development of a national economy, and questions of law. So three realms that connected to the imagination of the new republic and ideas of equality and a new type of society in a new public in the new republic. So in the end, I used the case to open out these areas of everyday life in this flawed new Chinese republic.
So I'd like to think a little bit more about the role of newspapers and magazines as you discussed them in the Republican era. And you'd already alluded to this a bit in your previous answer. At one point, you write that in the absence of effectively governing institutions, reporters, editors, and letter writers called for direct public action to resolve social issues, with newspapers as witness and record. Wary of law and the institutional apparatus of government, the press constituted itself, and not the law or state, as the appropriate arbitrator of public behavior. End quote. You also write that this social news quickened the pulse of daily reportage in the first weeks after Xi's suicide, soon morphed into poetry, fiction, etc. End quote. In the Eastern Times, for example, you write, so many readers sent submissions to the editor that the editor could not keep pace, even as he published more than 100 such compositions in the course of a week, end quote. One tabloid even produced a story that, hinted elusively at sexual relations between Tang and Xi, end quote. So I've thrown a lot at you here, but can you explain for people why newspapers were so dissatisfied with the Chinese government that they felt like they needed to be the moral and legal arbiters of society, yet at the same time produce scandalous, slanderous pieces about the death of a young woman? To many people in the general audience, this may feel like a contradiction. More broadly, can you tell us, what do these contradictions tell us about Chinese/Shanghai society in the early 20th century?
Okay, well, that's another big question, but I'm glad you asked about the press, because the press is both a major source for the study and also a player, one of the actors, in a sense, foundational actors in what happens. I'm interested in the early republic because it's interesting to see, in the context of China, what happens with the importation of this new form of government, which expresses a newly hegemonic notion of governing legitimacy. That is, there will be no more emperor. People will no longer be subjects. Instead, people will be citizens in a newly enshrined idea of governance that involves a notion of popular sovereignty, or government of the people. Of course, in the new Chinese Republic, the parliament and other institutions of state in that might construct democracy under the new republic are swiftly suppressed or otherwise fail. So I'm interested in this question of what happens with ideas of democracy or improvisations of democracy in this failed, newly imported but failed republic. And it seemed to me that there are two venues of the public of citizens, one being newspapers and one being public associations. So I'm tracking newspapers, and newspapers, as you suggest through those quotations that you highlighted, are a contradictory, fascinating and contradictory type of venue for democracy, as both a venue of public expression and a multivocal kind of source. There are all kinds of heterogeneous things and people writing and interests expressed through newspapers. And they're also plural in the city. There's not just one newspaper. At the same time, newspapers are commercial. So this is a commercial press, and there's nothing like scandal and sensation to build readership and to provide the funding that enables and fuels this print public. So what you're describing, or what you're highlighting as contradictory, is in a sense natural to newspapers. And yet, with all of these contradictions, what interested me about reportage on the case is, with all of the flaws and partial reporting of these different newspapers in their collectivity, in a sense, and in their conflicts with each other, it's possible to say that there is a kind of policing of accuracy, that is, putting all of the different newspaper accounts together, it was possible to assemble a fairly accurate account of what had transpired. That's not to say that any one newspaper was unbiased or accurate, but there was the play of newspapers created a kind of public field of information that was vital to the functioning of this, what should I say, somewhat free-floating ambient atmosphere of potential democracy that I was tracking.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that answered your question.
Yeah.
A little bit complicated. Yes, go ahead.
One thing that I appreciate about your research is that, as the title suggests, China does have a history of democracy. You note at one point in your book, strikingly, that even Chen Duxiu, who's one of the founding members of the CCP, advocated for something akin to a direct democracy. This understanding, I think, for many people in the West, runs contrary to the way that they understand China and its history. I'd like to cite two more quotes from you. First of all, you write, "What is of particular interest for this study beyond these beyond these more familiar aspects of Shanghai commercial culture is the way in which commercial publications, networks, and associations also became arenas for democratic contestation." You also write, "As the media landscape diversified, newspaper language, organization, and style conveyed novel notions of authority, identity, community, and political possibility. Editorials upheld the authority of the newspaper itself as the voice of public opinion." End quote. Based on the quotes that I've read to you, I have two questions. First, can you elaborate on the notions of democracy and activism that were existent in early 20th century China, and how it relates to both Tang and Xi? And then second, people tend to make the comment that we're sort of living in a post-truth society where political leaders and groups refer to ideas that run contrary to their ability to amass and maintain power as quote unquote fake news. While many seem to think that this is a phenomenon that's unique to our own time, can you comment on whether or not warlords and other political figures in the fractured China of the 20th century made similar comments about commercial institutions, associational groups, and newspapers that they found disagreeable?
Well, I'm glad that you made that initial observation about emphasizing that there is a history of democracy here, because this is something that keeps coming up. That is, it's not just past entirely. It's not just in the early 20th century that there is this history of democracy, but you see in events like Tiananmen in 1989, you see this sort of street democracy. If you look at recent events, well, until recently in Hong Kong, in Occupy, you see people enacting this kind of direct democracy in the streets that follows some of the patterns of what I look at here. So what's interesting in terms of this, what I've called a kind of a public without a republic. So it's a public that doesn't have a functioning democratic state. So the question is, how does it enact, or what are the venues for enacting citizenship? I talked about the press on the one hand, but you also have considerable associational activism. It's a public that embraces new ideas of access and equality, particularly for certain groups, so women being one, a new kind of public visibility for women. All of those are in play at the time, and also the meaning of democracy is very much a question. It's not clear, that is, you don't have, it's not institutionalized and it's not routinized. And of course, there are imported notions that appear in translation. So I'm interested in the neologisms, what they mean, as in the context of the New Culture and May 4th movement. Intellectuals describe democracy in new terms. They use phonetic terms to suggest that democracy is a foreign thing, so that in a sense displaces other earlier Chinese language for democracy. You also have terms coming in through Japanese But what this means in practice is, in a sense, improvisational. There are multiple possibilities, and sometimes this is worked out on the ground. This new language of democracy and this new language of a republic becomes the newly legitimate and, in a sense, hegemonic way, new way to be. But it is the tools of democracy, or the claims of democracy, or the claims of governing legitimacy of different public associations and figures all make reference to this same language and can use it to accuse each other of fake news or fake representation of the public. So this situation that we are looking at today of populism gone awry, or the ways in which different groups may empower themselves through a language of populism for anti-democratic purposes, is not a new, it's certainly not a new issue. I'm looking at it in a particular context, but that dynamics is very, very visible and very interesting for me in this particular study. And in terms of newspapers, there are, of course, newspapers that are organized by different political interests. And there's all kinds of infiltration of the press by fake stories or things of that order. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. We tend to get caught up in thinking that, you know, everything we're living through is some type of new or novel phenomenon. But, you know, there was yellow journalism back then. We call it clickbait today. You know, there was, I'm sure there were terms for fake news back then that we call fake news today. So I thought that was one interesting aspect of your research. So I'd like to turn now to including a sort of gender element of your research into a broader historical question. At the time of Xi Shangzhen's death, notions of feminism were becoming prominent in popular political discourse among both women and men. However, you've noted that despite Tang portraying himself as progressive, he reportedly asked Xi to be his concubine, as you mentioned previously. In the context of the discussions that were happening at the time, you posed the question, quote, if new style women committed suicide, and if men who professed the new learning were trying to turn educated women into new concubines, how could such figures usher forth a secular and scientific future, end quote. Anyone who reads your book will find that discussions of feminism, gender, capitalism, democracy, etc., are often paired with the word science or scientific in the discourse that was taking place in the years surrounding the May 4th movement. This term, in my reading, seems to be a stand-in somewhat for terms like modern and modernity. So my question is then, as historians, looking at these conversations that were taking place in 18th, 19th, 20th century, how should we define the terms modern and modernity? What do these terms mean? I've heard professors, for example, link modernity with the advent of electricity, others who defined it as the impetus of commercial globalization, or even others who have defined modernity as the start of when societies began to think of time as linear as opposed to circular. So, of course, I'm asking you a bit of a leading question because I brought up gender, and you even once taught a class that I was enrolled in called Gender and Modernity in China. So you can elaborate on that, but in addition to gender, what in your view is the best way to explain to a general audience, what does that term modernity even mean?
Okay, big question. Well, in general, I suppose I understand modernity as a kind of universalizing discourse of European model development through the expansive practices of colonialism and capitalism. It becomes globally hegemonic. And it involves all sorts of claims to progress, civilization, and all sorts of bars of measurement for different that effectively legitimate these expansive practices. In terms of my inclinations as a historian, I don't tend to be interested in describing modernity abstractly or defining it abstractly. What I'm interested in more is in how it develops local meanings, what it means in particular contexts, and certainly in terms of China's experience, you have this intertwined development of notions of the creation of a new modern nation state on the Western model of international law that configures the globe through these individual nation states, each with their imagined zone of sovereignty. That's very tied to the imagination of a new sexual equality and citizenship and a new kind of family. So feminism and transformed gender relations are very much a part of this story. I'm interested in, that is, generally this, we can talk about this discourse of imported modernity becoming globally hegemonic, but what interests me is what happens when unanticipated speakers or unforeseen contexts shape the meaning or alter the script in ways that are productive and engender new things. So it's not as if democracy will mean the same thing everywhere. It's not as if a stock market will function the same way in different places. These new terms or notions or measures will become hegemonic, but it's up to different actors how they will be inhabited and how they will play out. In general, if their dissemination and circulation in new context involves the creation of new kinds of words to express them, those words are forged in another linguistic environment that usually involves certain excesses of meaning. This is something that Lydia Liu talks about, but if you're using older Chinese words, or older Chinese words that have gone through a kind of Japanese kanji Meiji period transformation that's used to translate Western concepts and then is re-imported into China, you have all of these older resonances, new resonances, and extra linguistic elements that make them function in very interesting ways. So I'm interested in all of that. It seems to me all of that is tied up in changes in the imagination of society, gender, economics, law, in ways that are quite interesting. So I tried to map that rather than talk about it abstractly.
Mm-hmm. As a bit of an addendum to that question, in the China field, we tend to assign the beginning of modern Chinese history to the year 1842, 1912, or 1919. Although the historical conversations in your book take place around May 4th, which was obviously in 1919, I wonder if you would describe this general time period as being the start of modern China. If this is in fact what you think, I'd like to challenge that thought a bit by asking if you think China historians obsess over dates that indicate the beginning of modernity too much, the way that some Japanese scholars have been criticized for associating the start of modernity being at 1868, as tends to be the case in conversations in that field. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, because I don't see modernity as a set thing, it's more of an ideology. For me, I guess I wouldn't say that I wouldn't be invested in a particular date as a transformational moment into this thing. So I'm less invested in dates than in process, but dates are quite important. All of the things that I'm looking at that are themes in the book, gender, newspapers, new ideas of finance and economy, legal reform, all of those are things that begin in the late 19th century and are in various respects related to the impact of colonialism, imperialism, and the fall of the Qing dynasty. All of that engages an imagination of change along initially lines of national wealth and power as a forceful aspiration. That is imagined to be achievable through the reconstruction of a state, a new kind of state along Western lines. I guess I would say that while these are processes that begin in the late Qing, the Republic as a date is important because it forces this thinking about what is the Republic and the sense of failure of a Chinese public to enact this thing. So the being in a new era is important, especially this sense that this new era has failed. I guess I would say that my study, in some respects, because it does emphasize the Republic so much, tends to de-emphasize. It emphasizes the Republic in terms of the unleashing of these new ideas that are often associated with May 4th, but I find them very resonant before May 4th. Of course, they're apparent in the May 4th moment, but one of the things that the book does is show how these new ideas and practices of democracy are already emergent, especially in commercial institutions in Shanghai, something that I don't think has been sufficiently appreciated, how that develops and how that works in concert with the intellectual side of May 4th. That side is also visible in the commercial side. So that intrigued me.
Before we wrap up, I wanted to ask, I recently had done an interview with Jessica Hanser at University of British Columbia. And she, like you, utilized microhistory to expound larger historical phenomena that were taking place in the geographical and temporal spaces she was focusing on. And I asked her this question, and I'd like to ask you this too. In my observation, it seems like microhistory tends to be very sternly criticized by some scholars as being too narrow, it's impractical, it's frivolous, etc. In your view, why is microhistory important, and how does it make important contributions to the historical field?
I guess there are two paths for me in answering your question. One has to do with microhistory as a historical approach, and the other has to do with whether or not my book is microhistory. In terms of microhistory, I probably like looking deeply inside a particular event has the possibility of opening it up in ways that might be surprising. That is, we tend to have a certain storyline for thinking about modern Chinese history. But when you look deeply in one event, there's all this other stuff in there that just doesn't necessarily fit the usual narrative. So you have the possibility of opening things up. How useful microhistory is might depend entirely on how well the historian does it. If it's not that microhistory is necessarily narrow at all, it depends on how you configure study. In terms of what I'm doing, I'm not sure it's entirely microhistory. That is, it begins with a particular suicide. That suicide develops into a legal case. The suicide, for me, meant that I needed to understand ideas of suicide past and in this present. I needed to, as I began to understand gender, I needed to understand the new woman, not just the woman who committed suicide, but also other notions of woman, so that I understood what the figure of the concubine meant. Then I had to understand about concubinage and how new gender relations might seem to some people as new concubine type relations, as people entered into free love marriages, but as the men were often previously married. There was something undefined about new free love relations or free love intimacies. To understand the legal case, I needed to get into the legal environment, the question of legal reform, Chinese courts, Western courts in the city. And of course, the legal case involved not just the gender question and the concubine question, but also the question of the stock exchange. And then I had to figure out the Chinese stock exchange and some economic history, but also the imagination of finance. So for me, understanding this one, what might have seemed initially a small case. In fact, I initially thought this project would be a neat little project, but it just kept billowing outward. There was more and more that I had to understand, and I kept turning it around. So it kept opening things up rather than closing them down. I imagine that if you used microhistory to close other things out, it could indeed be narrowing. For me, focusing on the case and the puzzles of the case kept taking me to new sources. And being a modern historian, I had the great advantage of multiple sources. So I have a much more extensive evidentiary base than might be typical of many microhistories in which you don't have a lot of records on other records on the sorts of individuals that are involved. But I ended up having police records. I had records of foreign police. I had the newspapers. I had archives in France and in Japan. And as it turned out, these archives of the American Jewish Russian journalist figure, this peculiar figure, Sokolsky, whose archives are at Stanford University. And then I found the writings of Xi Shangzhen herself. She was kind of a cipher for me initially, but then I realized that one source preserved her writings, which had been kept by a female friend of hers. So I was even, in the end, I felt I even was able to get a certain grip on her. I had external discussions of her as she was represented by some of her proponents or by feminists who wanted to claim her for a kind of new woman. But then I had her sources that took me into her own imagination. So I feel fairly comfortable in the end. It took me many years to feel comfortable, to feel like I had any grip on this case, but in the end, I felt it helped me understand many things. So I was glad to have come upon it.
Reading this book, one thing that came to my mind that I'd be curious to know is, for people like me reading this book, I'm someone who studies Chinese history as well. I guess, what would you want other scholars of China to take away from reading this book, whether they be from the West or from China? If this is, a book that's assigned in class one day or just something they're reading on their own, what do you hope that would be like the biggest one or two things that they take away from reading this?
Okay, well, as I said, the book took me into many different realms. And so I wouldn't describe this as a one big idea book. But I think that by going into entering into these realms of the redefinition of everyday life in the context of the Republic enables an understanding of what these abstract ideas that we often talk about that informed the New Republic meant for people living through it, how they negotiated these new ideas. I think the book conveys a different understanding of democracy in this period as something with an ongoing life in China. You see its workings very much through society, in this case, through Shanghai society. So there's a sort of take-home lesson on China and democracy. Also, I think it raises a kind of new perspective on law and the rule of law and the way in which plural legal systems in this period may have affected people's understandings of the rule of law for a longer period. I think May 4th also looks different because of the way in which the case calls attention to connections between changing ideas of the market and capitalism and new imaginations of science and democracy in this period. Finally, I guess it raises questions about the imagination of finance more broadly. That's actually where I'm going next in my new project. I was really fascinated by these 150 plus stock exchanges that operated in Shanghai in this period and what that could possibly mean. And of course, the stock exchange itself is a kind of a translation of some imported notion, both of economics and development. So that's where I am now.
Dr. Goodman, once again, your book is The Suicide of Miss Xi, Democracy and Disenchantment in the Chinese Republic. Thanks for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This was a real pleasure.
And for those who want to see more content, you can go to the What is Asia podcast YouTube channel or nakotadefonso.com. We'll see you in the next episode.